You can take it off. So now it's the real me. And I'm going to conclude these I'm going to conclude this series of discussions by essentially taking on something that was left unfinished by him. And let me do this. Something that was left unfinished and that I made an effort, eventually successful, partially successful, to complete it. And in completing it, I decided to move into a different direction. So really what I'm showing you is something that not only operates a transition, but also becomes a link, a connection between what was the past and hopefully will be the future. So it is something that builds directly on what Peter, myself, I suppose, and Sambit talked about, but actually moves from artifacts, projects as eventually resulting into artifacts, to projects essentially depending on people and what people do with the tools of production. That's why the title is Agencies of Technological Change in Contemporary Building. It's all very well to talk about buildings as artifacts, but what is the structure or the social structure of production that underlies the process that will eventually lead to the completion of those buildings? So essentially, if we look at the building as the product of an industry, of a system in its own right, what are the cogwheels that we need to work on? How do the various cogwheels relate to one another, particularly when they come from different families, from different traditions, from different technological systems? Now, this is a project that I acquired in 2015 due to the events that essentially led us here today. And it was a grant that was gained through the Australian Research Council for 2011-13 that literally said digital fabrication technologies, partly in opposition to what Sambit just said, analyzing patterns of adoption and innovative transformations in architectural design and practice. So what happens when you actually take something from a laboratory, even at discussion level, and try and translate and put it down into the territory, into the landscape of practice? And Bharat's ideas had to do with developing a detailed study of selected Australian design and construction projects, varying scales and level of complexity and organization structures. Don't know where I put my glasses, but that employ, I know that I have this one on, it's just I need another one. Okay. With different materials and technologies of design, fabrication, assembly. So he wanted to look at triggers, what leads people to adopt particular technologies, what are the knowledge networks that become necessary as a result of the choices made in terms of adoption, what are, by consequence, by extension, the emerging organizational and process transformations that we should look at, what are, and that is implicit, what is the range of technology that we should be using, what are the gaps or the mediations that exist, and eventually the imperfections between the ideal geometries that somehow Sambit was talking about and the way in which these geometries become manifested in the built environment. And last but not least, what is the afterlife of the experience that one gains by looking on particular projects? Now, this project, don't know what's happening, okay. So this project was developed by selecting 3 small projects that had just been completed in Melbourne. Something called the Web Bridge, which is a little architectural folly in a part of Melbourne named Docklands, which essentially completes a solution of continuity that existed between one part of Docklands and an original built bridge structure that got cut off. So it's a small little thing. Then there was another small project, which was a beach house done by a small architectural firm that divided its life between New South Wales on the eastern coast of Australia and the United States, and which is really a traditional beach shack. This is the image from behind, but then if you pay attention to the underside of the steps, you can see this actually, the structure is made out of a series of CNC cut plywood components that are produced met at a particular geometry through a steel butterfly node, which provides spanning and stiffness at the same time. And okay, so you can see this is the underside of the house, which eventually became so successful in the world of prefabrication that one of our friends decided to select it for an exhibition that took place at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and this is the reincarnation of that original shack into the parking garage, into the parking lot right next to MoMA. The last one was the Southern Cross Station, right in the centre of Melbourne, done by a very powerful entente of architectural firms, Grimshaw Architects in collaboration in joint venture with Daryl Jackson Associates from Melbourne. And what was interesting about these three projects is that they did not only vary in size and programmatic complexity, but also vary in contractual organization. So one was an own build project, the one in the center. The one on the left was a project that was developed and led in traditional fashion. And the one on the right was in fact a project that was developed as a public-private partnership. So there was major project finances that was provided by a financial consortium. And as you will see, this will become critical in understanding how technology is adopted and why. So how did Bharat proceed at the beginning of this project? He proceeded in a very Bharatesque and, if you will, traditional way, by going exactly through the process that Sambit described, by looking at all the documentation of the offices, from the initial sketches through the various digital simulations, which I don't have here, all the way to the supply chain of the components. So either the quarrying or the melting, the procurement of the materials, that transportation onto the manufacturing site, the actual welding and construction of the various components, the testing of the components, the transportation of the components, the assembly of the components, the final erection of the building. Now, this was done in a sense that this is partly non-traditional because we're not actually used, or we're not particularly interested in following or highlighting, delineating the history of things that happen before the construction of the building. But this was very much Bharat's idea, to see how ideas get translated through a particular process into a product. And the way in which he organized to do that is by becoming an historian and chronicling the life of the project from inception all the way to the handover to the client and eventually to the users. So what this very pale slide is trying to suggest to you, that he had to become really a recent past archaeologist of those particular projects and try to determine year by year, month by month, what a number of people had done and how they had contributed to these particular projects. Now, why would you do something like this? Because unless you do something like this, you won't be able to understand the structure, the organizational structure behind the projects. So what really, this is for the train station. So really what happens, not only in terms of the formalization of the contracts, but in relation to the socio-technical network of transactions. So you have something that allows you to understand how the client is related to which particular parties, what are the parties that do take part in the history of the project. Now, of course, this could actually look like a somewhat aseptic, neutral description of the project, particularly from Bharat's point of view and from Sambit's point of view, because unless you understand how information is produced and above all exchanged within the project, then you might as well not have done this. And so in Bharat's case, he was actually using this to then arrive at a mapping of the projects in terms of the data exchange process. So you not only have the people that are involved in the project, but also try to understand how they actually, what information they are producing and how they're passing that information to which company. So at the end of 2014, this is the stage at which this research project had advanced, with lots of information, lots of systemic structuring of these particular projects, but possibly the findings of this project or the subsequent strategies had not been defined yet. And so 2015 comes. And in 2015, I received the approval from the Australian Research Council to take over and see what could have been done with this project. Now, one of the conditions was that because it was public funding, nothing could be changed in terms of the examples, in terms of the strategic objectives of the project. But of course, the way in which you go about doing that has much to do with who you are, as much as well as with what you're trying to achieve. So one of the things that I found myself considering, together with friends, some of whom are here, is how do you actually move from a project that is someone else's to your own project, and how do you actually put yourself into the shoes of your friends? So I thought that one of the first things to do was to try and redefine conceptually the project. Not by changing the premises, but by interpreting the premises from my own point of view. So from my perspective, I come from practice, from the design process, from the building process. I'm a construction person. Bharat was an information scientist. And so from a building process perspective, there is a major epistemological issue here, that we don't have enough literature. As possibly Peter was also suggesting, we don't have, the construction discipline is not particularly well developed from a scholarly point of view. And one of the reasons, I think, from my perspective, is that the literature that we deal with, so the literal building projects, tends to deal with design as a product, as artifacts, rather than a social activity. And because of this, what we have as descriptions are space and physical components, whereas the professional transactions that underlie the entire process tend to be overlooked. And so, if you will, this epistemological problem produces, engenders an issue which is critical, not only because it is important, but also because it has to do with our interpretation of the process. Consider that transactions in building and in design are made complex by two things. One is the collective nature of building design work. Even the smallest building requires contribution from hundreds of people. In each economy, at least one person out of 8 is involved in building. So anything that we do as designers and builders requires contribution from a vast array of people. But the other thing is that this vast array of people is brought together for a limited period of time. So project coalitions are temporary by definitions, are formed around the project and they're dismissed after the project ends. So is there a solution to this? And I thought that part of this research project was to suggest a solution to the discipline. We certainly know that practice, professional practice, has found its own solution to this, which is called professional or technical culture. So each locale, each region tends to develop historically a technical culture that is there to deal with diversity and variations of project permutations, in a sense within reason, which is what is allowed by the industrial system. And they do that. These cultures do develop, locales do develop technical cultures by agreeing on a body of knowledge and sharing this body of knowledge. It essentially allows us to understand the work required and the protocols involved. So their questions from a technological innovation point of view becomes a critical one, and possibly a natural one, a very consequent one. What happens to the technical cultures that are in place when disruption is caused by technology? That is, when the projects that these cultures are called on to support either imply the use or seek to embrace or introduce innovative digital technologies that are, by definition, external to those cultures, because otherwise there wouldn't be. A culture is by definition conventional, and therefore may redefine the loops involved in the process or the conventions on which these cultures are based. So if that was the case, then the research question should be, how one can go about understanding this culture by investigating types and patterns of interaction within communities of practice, and also by doing something that in a sense was a practical stratagem, tactic that we use, that is, forget about the buildings, forget about the project, but focusing on building individual building technologies, building systems. Because the design and building process of a building is such a complex undertaking that if you try to understand everything, you'll end up with understanding very little. So why don't we try and select something that we consider to be significant within this project and see how it was brought to being as far as the process was concerned. Now, this is not a new idea. Particularly the idea of community of practice is something that was being used in the United States at the very start of this research project. This is the Lewis School of Management at Case Western University in Ohio, built, as you can, or designed at least, as you can imagine, by Frank Gehry, which was completed in 2003-2004. Now, inside this building, there was an organizational behavior scientist by the name of Richard Bolland, who was already very famous, but became even more famous within the architectural community because he used its own building to, in a sense, lay out, articulate, and try to reflect and understand on the impact that the technological innovations brought about by Gary's office in building this building would actually sort of domino down to percolate through the industrial network that was building the building over 4 or 5 years. And so eventually they ended up writing this thing, which is called Wakes of Innovation in Project Networks, the case of digital 3D representation in architecture, engineering, and construction. This is something that took the world, the professional world, by storm. I was a visiting professor at Harvard in 2005, and these guys at Case Western would organize workshops on what innovative construction would do to the building industry. And I remember there was one weekend in which no one was in Cambridge because everyone had flown up to Case Western to be part of this workshop. Architects, engineers, industrial designers, lawyers, project managers, and all of that. Now, the major point about this particular work was the concept of wakes of innovation. So according to Richard Bolland, wakes of innovation are particular technical phenomena that tend to propagate among communities that are not homogeneous by themselves, but they're all bound through practicing on a particular project. And the way in which they propagate is by establishing what he calls a path creation, which results in a deviation from an established pattern of practice. And the way in which this path is created, or arises, if you will, is in an intercalated way, in a sense that first there is one innovation that then bounces off another practitioner, that then ricochets on another practitioner. So they don't all happen at the same time, but eventually they cascade down to the entire industry. They occur, therefore, at different rates and different times in different professions involved with building. And the way in which they move between one firm and the other is through what he calls trading zones. And so trading zones are professional spaces that exist at the boundaries, the work boundaries between firms during a project. Now, this was all very well. But in a sense it was already done, and there was something that still I wasn't convinced about. And the last 2 days I went with dear friends of mine that are here to Kochi to see the art biennale, and essentially something lit up. And it's the fact that these descriptions of the industry, Bharat's included, although they're very comprehensive, ecumenical, if you say Catholic, Peter said, they are not including one component. They talk about firms. Even the time when projects tend to be sort of disarticulated, they still get disarticulated into the minimum units of production that are construction firms, architectural firms, engineering firms, and all that. So people disappear as much as they disappeared in this particular installation in Kochi. So you have the fetishization of the office or the firm and the equipment, and the ghostization, I don't know what the word would be, of the workforce involved that are actually pushed outside and they become disembodied from the office. So, in order to respond to this, I didn't know that I was thinking in these terms, so I went through this act of reckoning only a few months after, in fact years after I started this project. With my partner in crime, Blair Gardiner, we decided to see whether we could actually define a new dictionary of work that would make sense of what the workforce does within an office or within a project structure where innovation is introduced. So, I'm going to introduce you to these new categories of design and building practice in innovative environments. Sponsor, driver, designer, manager, controller, producer, translator, facilitator, user, bystander, and challenger. Each one has its own definition, and they don't depend on any established profession. Anyone that contributes, any firm that contributes to the process can indeed act in these various capacities. So what determines who you are is what you do, not the hat that you wear or the profession that you're part of. Now, once we try to look at Bharat's information in this respect, some interesting things happened. So, this is the beach shack, the burst house, which has functional roles in each of those categories. Now, the colors here define different professions, different participants in the industry. So you have the client, the red. There are no builders or developers because this is an owner-builder project, and the blue is the architect. It was a very small project, and the architect, who also happened to be the part owner, essentially did everything with students and with friends. So you see that there is someone who's the design architect who's involved with everything, and then everyone is a user of the digital technology, the information technology introduced. Then we go into the other one, the web bridge, which was an interesting project because it didn't depend, the program did not depend on what an architectural firm wanted to do, but rather on an art competition organised by the City of Melbourne as part of the Urban Design Art Program. So it was an artist, Robert Owen, that decided what to do with that particular space. And then it became the challenge for the executive architect, that was Dental Corker Marshall, to actually give it a construction dimension. So here we have, interestingly, the people developed the concern with the existence of the building that are bystanders. They don't do anything. They play no role in the introduction, in the adoption of technology, not even the person that provided the initial idea for the project. Whereas in this case was the project architect, someone that was actually involved with the challenges required to build the project, that said, look, guys, we have a problem. We need to build it in a particular way. And then we have someone here, which is a shop drawer. And the shop drawer, so essentially, initially, traditionally, a documentation firm that is involved in each of the required function, from driver to designer to manager to controller, everything all the way to the user of digital technology. So bear with me for 2 minutes. Then we have Southern Cross Station. Large building with a floor plate of 60,000 square meters, done by 2 highly sophisticated architectural firms, coupled with a number of highly sophisticated engineering firms. So here we have a client which is partially disinterested for the very simple fact that it's a public-private partnership. Then we have a developer that becomes the sponsor of the adoption of technology. And we have a number of roles that are sort of scattered almost randomly around the project team. Once again, there is the shop drawer entity that appears in every one. Here you will see that everyone actively involved in the project becomes an active user of the digital technology produced, the equipment, the digital information produced, and so forth. If we look at these 3 projects, one next to the other, you will see that in essence, the social division of labor, the social division of responsibilities within the project changes a great deal. And in a sense, they become reflective of what the project is about. This one, it's all blue and scattered throughout. It doesn't have particular bands of functions because it's a very small project, makeshift. And I will tell you right now, the introduction of technology has got nothing to do with the building itself, but rather with the interests of the owner and the fact that he wanted to use as an experiment for the possible introduction of information technology in the mass production and mass customization of houses. Here you have something else which I have already discussed, but you have these lines between these 2 projects. And curiously, they belong to the same company. This is a small project which happens to take place within the same industrial context at Southern Cross. The 2 projects are less than 2 kilometers apart. And so this is someone very lungimirant, very forward-looking, that essentially decides, with prior experience as well, decides to jump on the bandwagon of this project in order to develop his knowledge. And then on the basis of the knowledge developed here, it also becomes selected for this particular project here. So this is the first thing. Now, is it enough, according to Bharat's view of the world? Because you also wanted to understand what are the patterns of information exchange. So, how do we go about finding those patterns, and what are we interested in finding out? Well, what we're interested in finding out is not so much which firm passes information to which other firm, but if we are interested in the political economy and the technological repercussions of this, even from a social point of view, we want to know who in that particular company plays a particular role. So this is the exercise that we went through by looking at Bharat's data. And this is one possible way of doing it. So, we have the dots, and now we have to understand which ones are the important dots in the life of the process, and whom these people have talked to in making a decision about the adoption of technology. So here, in the small shack, you have the driver, who's the design architect. Really, there was no sponsor there because the project had problems even from financial point of view. And then you have this interesting constellation here, which essentially are all his friends that play different roles. One of them, this one here, that plays too, eventually became an expert in fabrication technologies and works in Queensland now. Now, there are 2 particular triangles of information exchange, one between him, that wasn't there because also has an office in America, and his best friend, and university instructor that was working in Newcastle in New South Wales. So he spoke with his friend in terms of the management, and he spoke with his friends in terms of the problem of the site. And then the same people, essentially, this guy with the students from the University of Newcastle, actually became the producer of that information. But in order to produce that information, they also needed to communicate with the people that would eventually cut the plywood and supply the plywood. There is no engineer here and no contractor, because there were major problems with bringing established profession into the fray of this particular project. And so here you can see that the patterns of communication in the project changes immensely, regardless of the contractual relations of the project firm, as one would call it. So you have bystanders, the one that have essentially produced the building, don't do much. The design architect and the project architect do the driving of the project, particularly the project architect, because he's the one that needs to build it. The design architect becomes a driver, but the most, and it is in connection, in some form of communication with the artist. But what's important here is the link, the relationship between the artist that doesn't do anything in terms of information technology, but needs to make sure that the project architect who's producing an information remains truthful to his initial idea of the artwork, and so forth. Then there is the engineer that has a designing role. When I say design here, it's not about the designing of the building, but it's about designing the connections of the various technologies that will be used digitally. Once again, the engineer is in contact with the design architect and with the production team of the architect, but is also in contact with the shop drawer. And the shop drawer becomes a major driver for one, well, natural, if you will, but interesting reason from a technological evolution point of view, because he's the one that plays the engineer. The engineer doesn't have the equipment to do that, and so he delegates his roles in terms of information production to the shop drawer, which in the meantime is becoming incredibly sophisticated in doing that. And then last but not least, we go through Southern Cross Station, which is once again a completely different thing. Now, the sponsor here is the developer. And why would a developer sponsor technological innovation? Because it's risky. So a developer is not supposed to do it. But the reason why they did it is because it was a particularly complex project from a geometric point of view, and this is a public-private partnership. There's project financing involved. So the developer wanted to make sure that everything coincided and was delivered on time, because otherwise major quantities of financing would be lost. The driver would remain the design architect, but at this point becomes even more the shop drawer that becomes in a sense, the multitasking unit, and is essentially connected to the engineer, which in this case become the information clearinghouse. So even here, we can see that the moment we start comparing projects, not in terms of the firms involved, not in terms of the technology, but in terms of what people do, then different things start to emerge. Now, if we want to go back to Bharat and back to this discussion, we have to ask ourselves, where does that leave us from an innovation point of view? So given the locale and given the setting, if you will, I thought that we had to use our modularing friends in order to make that point. And so here we came up with different categories. A champion, someone that essentially stands by the lector like me. Different type of enablers, people that make the adoption of technology possible. Observers, people that are there, part of the project, but don't do much. Idler, people that don't take part willingly into the process. Or diversionist, people that refuse to be part of the process and thereby hamper the development of it. Where would these people be placed in these projects? Well, we're still in the process of writing this thing and finishing looking it up. But essentially if you look at what people do rather than who people are, you will find a different geography of positioning, an interesting geography of positioning. In the burst house, the design architect was the champion and one of the major drivers through his friends. all the other people had to enable their process through the community of practice that they were part of. With the web bridge, it's interesting that the person that authored the building is nowhere to be seen. He couldn't care less how the building was made, what it was made of, and how it was produced. He provided the concept, the idea. Really, the project architect here, not even the design architect, it was the project architect that said, guys, we need to get ourselves organized in such a way as to be able to do this and deliver it within time. Once again, another champion at this point was the shop drawer, because there was a commercial vested interest in getting to the top of that particular game. And once again, you see that there are a lot of enablers. Essentially, everyone involved in this scheme becomes an enabler. So when we look, once again, here, developer. The developer is the champion on innovative technology adoption here, because there is too much at stake. And so they want to make sure that once a particular project is selected, they will be able to make it properly. And once again, the shop drawer. So here we go. When we consider the geography of, the social geography of innovation, you can see people positioned in very different locations depending on the projects that they part and the context, in a sense, that they part of. And so on the basis of this work, which will be finished in the next 6 months, I'm putting the provisional 4 ideas to you that essentially these analyses brought up. The first one is that what we've been hearing through, not through Sambit, but through the positivist friends of information technology is not true. Technological uptake, possibly I jumped ahead. So technological uptake is not necessarily contingent on project type, scale, or context. These are 3 very different projects, 3 different scales, and each one of them took up, adopted a particularly innovative technology. Yet, what these histories have shown that the challenges that are specific to those projects are important in determining the decision to adopt digital fabrication technology. So it's not per se about fabrication technology, but it is about the problems that that technology can help resolve. Now, the number 2 is that technological uptake, at least in what we've seen, relies on technical rationales that are not necessarily internal to the information, the digital technology, but rather to the rationales of the project. In one case, had to do with a particular ideology that wanted to show and prove the viability of CNC cutting for traditional beach house typologies. In another case, had to do with the challenges that are produced by the geometry of a very complex, large canopy. And in one other case, still had to do with the formal complexity brought up by an artistic conception of an urban design competition. Now, the third one, though, which I think is quite important, that once you decide to adopt that technology, the successful adoption relies on the community of practice. So all the people that work on that project from start to finish, and the ability of the actors, of the people that comprise that community to drive, enable, or endure innovative processes. In a sense, there have to be no victims in the process, otherwise the process will not go away. One of the things that I forgot to mention is that there were no challenges, of course, in these processes, and there were some idlers that we're going into eventually, into our analysis, but everyone was part of the process. And even the presence of what I would call analogical operators, so people that are used to work in the world of drawing, in the world of mortar, in the world of sweat and labor, do not constitute per se a barrier to adoption. In fact, in our case, many of the traditional actors are the ones that say, bring in the technology because we need it. Not because we are ideologically inclined to their use, but because they solve a problem which is there to be solved. Now, The other thing that didn't seem to constitute a hurdle to this was the lack of knowledge. So in a sense, you don't need to know everything about digital technology or digital fabrication technology in order to adopt it. In each and every one of these projects, there was a mass of non-developed knowledge that was essentially required to get up to scratch with the others in order to perform properly. One thing, though, that remained critical to this was the existing industrial capacity of the context. And when I'm talking about industrial capacity, I try to go outside the community of practice. So communities of practice can exist in a bubble inside an industry that works in a different way. But the moment they need to resort to the knowledge in that industry in order to resolve challenges that are internal to the project, there can't be an unevenness between what the community of practice is trying to do and what the industry around it is trying to do. So this is a defining condition when preparing for adoption. The reason I'm saying this is because in the history of this process, this house, which possibly was the most revolutionary, was the one that ran into major problems because they were trying to operate an experiment in an industry, the residential industry in Australia, that is not used to that type of technology and has such consolidated practices, essentially the social engineering, that wouldn't even consider getting into this. And that's why the project had to develop as a self-contained unit. Whereas these two projects here were developed in Victoria, in the heart of Victoria, in the industrial technological heart of Australia. So here, the problem was not to invent new knowledge, but to select companies that had that particular type of knowledge or companies that were aspiring to becoming the top of that particular specialty. So, at the end of all this, where does that leave us with our work and what we wanted to do? And so what I have here is essentially is the draft of the book chapter that we are writing on this particular thing. And normally I don't read things, but I thought that this one here was, in a sense, the text of a notional dialogue with Bharat. So what I would imagine us to be discussing at the end of this study. And so if you don't mind, I would like to share a few lines with you so that I can then move on to the conclusion. And so I think that what we've done shows is that irrespective of the emphasis placed by information technology pundits on the inevitable onslaught of numerically controlled machinery into building, what we've done raises a question. Should construction scholars, and I'm adopting the definition of Peters, let others worry about the hardware, the information hardware or the digital fabrication hardware, and rather concern ourselves with the social software of the industry? By social software, I mean its people, its work protocols, its established relationship, its culture. Are these indeed the real determinants or barriers to change, even in digital matters? And I thought, and I would discuss this with him, that the projects that he had selected would actually show that there is a lot of input to this particular proposition. Because in fact what we've seen is that digital technology or digital fabrication technology is available, but the reason for adopting or the way in which we successfully implement it has to do with who we are and how we work with one another rather than the hardware itself. So I'm not going to bother with the other part, but essentially there is this relationship between the hardware of the technology and the social software of the industry. But that, of course, goes back to what Peter, I think, was alluding to, and the possibility that the technological advance, which sometimes look very successful, should indeed be addressed critically by those of us that are in the profession and those of us, even like myself, who have a position in construction as well as a position in architecture. And the reason why I'm saying this is because regardless of what we've said, and I'm going back to the reading, when the fact that the 3 projects were eventually built, and mind you, went on to receive numerous accolades from around the world, they were still built under regimes of imperfect technological knowledge about their construction and then design performance. So, when we look, or anytime someone wanted to look in detail at the physical results of the process undergone in this way, we should warn ourselves against the dangers of placing the digital manufacturing cart ahead of the proverbial industry's ox, particularly when the pathways have not been created as yet or have not been clear of long-standing hurdles. And so even though each one of these projects may appear as a glistening examples of digital manufacturing from distance, it invariably owes its actual implementation to non-digital elements, either social or trade-based. And it's possibly on this problematic relationship, at the center of our profession, that the study of technological innovation and its non-technological factors and repercussions should dwell. And we do have a long tradition in this. And to reiterate it, I will leave you with this image. That is a big image that Bharat took in Manvi. He was very fond of the shipbuilding tradition there, and shows that sometimes number can coexist with people and their skills. Thank you very much. Yes. Snehal is asking me whether, well, I already have one. If we want to have questions, we want to open a debate. I think there is a great opportunity to hear other people's views and share them with friends.
So if there are any questions.
Or any contributions.
Any contributions too.
Oh, it's been a long afternoon.
Yes, it's very long.
I think we should thank everyone for participating.
I think we have to thank Mala for sure, and Paolo, and rest assured Bharat's spirit is going to be there forever with us in the new library. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Paolo. Thank you all the speakers, Peter, Sambit, Blair, Rahul just left. But thank you very much. Bye-bye.